brand strategy is an interesting one because it sort of fits somewhere in between business strategy and marketing strategy, but it can sort of move around a bit. Whereas your marketing strategy typically will be subservient to your business strategy.
Hello and welcome to Brand Tuned, a podcast on brand management that covers trademarks and IP as they're intrinsic to brand equity. I'm your host, Shireen Smith, author of Brand Tuned. Writing this led to Byron Sharp's evidence-based research stressing distinctiveness over differentiation, which I largely agree with, though not totally. Hence our tagline, Sharp Branding. My guest today is JP Caslin, Chief Executive of Rouser, an international strategic consultancy specializing in global business and marketing strategy. He is a columnist for Marketing Week and contributor to the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising's Effectiveness Works. He used to be known as JP Hansen and has now taken his wife's name. JP, welcome to the Brand Tune podcast.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you very much for having me.
So tell us a bit more about your background. I gather you were a lawyer too at one stage, so I'm dying to hear more about your background.
Yes, so I have a bit of an unorthodox background for a strategist, I suppose. The very first thing I studied at university way back when was marketing, and then I eventually also went to law school. So I did work for a bit for a law firm doing primarily M&A, so mergers and acquisitions, and corporate finance and corporate governance. Mm-hmm. But then eventually I realized that what I really found interesting, and probably as well where my sort of talent lie, to the degree that one can say such a thing, was within strategy and governance. So eventually that led me to do more strategic work, ended up at Rouser, and I've been at Rouser now for going on 6 years. And actually as a bit of I suppose, a bomb to some people, is I'm actually leaving Rouser now.
Right.
Yes, to become an independent consultant. So that I can work more with agencies and support them rather than work as a competitor to them.
Right. Okay. I thought it was your own business. So it's somewhere you've been working then for a while.
Well, I was one of the co-founders originally, and then the other people will probably carry on. It is merely one of those things, and I do hope that they are not offended by this. And it sounds, because it does sound a bit pretentious, I suppose, but my quote unquote personal brand has become so much larger than that of Rouser that I've kind of outgrown them. But also I think it's time to move on and do other things, not least because I'm publishing a couple of things at the moment which are quite controversial, and I'd rather if there is any negative feedback, I'd rather that it fall on my head than those of sort of the other people I work with. Okay,
so you're going to be providing the same sort of services, but through your own business, is that right?
Yes, largely speaking, I am going to do more of what one might call strategic management and also complexity management. Over the last year or so, my work has been primarily split into two. So it's been global strategy for clients, and then also complexity management. And that is also a topic of a book that I'm writing at the moment. So it's I'm taking a slight step to the left, so to speak, compared to what I've done in the past. But I think it's the right move, or at least I hope so. And my wife really hopes so. So we'll see.
I must say, I was reading Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt, and it's certainly very complex, the sort of scenarios he describes. It's a great book with valuable nuggets, but not an easy read and not really easy to translate for small business, which is what 96% of businesses are micro businesses. I noticed that he disparages the templated approach of focusing on vision, mission, and values. So I'd love to understand the considerations that you would take into account when setting business strategy and brand strategy, really.
Well, I think there are two different things. Let's
Mm.
start there. But whether one works with visioning and missioning, I think it's entirely up to the company. Now, me personally, I don't put too much stock into vision and mission. Because I recognize that it can work as a sort of an alignment tool, although there are different ways of achieving alignment in an organization.
Mm.
The problem is that a lot of the time, if you've studied anthropology 101, you know that the second you write down your values, they are forever lost.
Mm.
And that is a problem with those kinds of value statements, or, we're going to be this kind of company or that kind of company. It's great if you have that idea in mind, but you need to be open to changing it as you go, and be a bit more flexible than perhaps some companies are. But again, visioning, missioning, if it works for you, then by all means, go ahead and do it. It's not something that I necessarily rely on, but, to each their own, I suppose.
Right. So it's really ultimately a way of setting your strategy. So what would you recommend is a good way to approach business strategy?
Well, it presupposes that strategy is, if I'm not sort of misinterpreting your question, we're talking now about strategy as in deliberate strategy, because the thing is that there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of strategy. So you have deliberate strategy, which is the traditional approach, whereby you would create these kinds of documents, and it would be, if I were to boil it down to something, it would be effectively a plan, right? And programming. We're going to do this and going to do that, and so on and so forth. But then you have this thing called emergent strategy. And emergent strategy is effectively patterns in action over time. So Henry Mintzberg, for example, writes a fair bit about that. And any company in the real world, so to speak, the strategy will always be a mix of both, because a deliberate strategy is never executed. The pieces will never fall into place just as you had foreseen. It just doesn't work like that. But of course, at the same time, you can't have a fully emergent strategy because you need some sort of semblance of structure. So if I were to work with an organization, typically if I work with a startup or a small company, I would essentially start with what Peter Drucker might call the concept of business, which basically is what is this company about? Where do we want to go? And just the basics. Do we sell car tires, or do we sell, rubber shoes or confectionery, whatever it is? And then off of that, you basically build your various strategies. And you have this thing called, what we call, I created this concept with a former colleague called Gary Rivers, this thing called the strategy hierarchy. So basically, the strategy hierarchy is a meta strategy. It's a strategy for strategies. It's basically how various strategies within the organization will work with one another. So to your point about brand strategy is an interesting one, because it sort of fits somewhere in between business strategy and marketing strategy, but it can sort of move around a bit. Whereas your marketing strategy typically will be subservient to your business strategy. And the further down you get in this hierarchy, all the way down into, let's call it campaign strategy, the more explicit it will be, and the more programming there will be, probably. But again, you need to create some sort of scaffolding early on. So you need to define that, and that, again, how you do that is entirely up to you. But I would create some sort of formal document, and keep it simple and keep it short. One of the problems that we see with clients, especially small clients, is that they create strategy documents that are, 50, 11 different PowerPoint slides, and no one even reads half of it, which kind of defeats the purpose of it. So anyway, so that's where I'll start.
Okay, so you have a hierarchy of all the different strategies that are going to be relevant to the business. So maybe IT strategy is in there, intellectual property strategy, whatever's going to be some key strategies for the business. Is that right? Or is there a templated approach where you would cover it?
No, I think it's more of a way of thinking about things. So typically at the top, you would find a corporate strategy, because you can have many businesses within the same corporation. Then beneath that, you have your business strategy, and then everything else will fall into place beneath that. Your IP strategy, for example, will, of course, we'll have certain parts that are defined early on in the business strategy, whatever it might be that the IP in question is. But then, of course, you're going to have emergent parts of that as well, because you do discover things along the way. And innovation is, notoriously complex, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you need to take something from one piece of the hierarchy and put it somewhere else. And the emergent strategy the traditional view is sort of from the top to the bottom, right? That's the way that the communication goes, and that's the way the hierarchy goes. The emergent bit is basically the opposite. So that goes from the bottom up into the top. And to take a very simple example of that, so let's say that you're a salesperson, right? And that most people would consider to be tactical. You're quote unquote on the proverbial floor. Now, let's say that you have your targets and you have your markets and so on and so forth, but then one day you get this idea of maybe actually I'm going to go after that market, right? And going into that market actually turns out to be quite successful. Now, that's a tactical decision that you've taken. It might be that all your colleagues, all the other salespeople in the organization notice this and follow suit. And then that's successful. That all of a sudden, the organization as a whole has moved into a new market. Now, that's strategic, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be an example of an emergent aspect or emergent strategy that sort of takes something that is tactical and moves it up the quote unquote hierarchy. And you have to allow those things to happen as well. If you just have your very narrow, this is the way we're going to do things and never go outside of that, then, the problem with that is that it has a very nasty habit of catastrophically breaking if you can't foresee everything and something comes out of left field. So again, create the hierarchy. Various bits will fit into various parts of the hierarchy depending on what kind of company you are, and then be open to allowing things to emerge. And if you do that, you're going to be well on your way, I'd say.
Sure. So you're allowing things to emerge as market conditions are felt.
Yes. So absolutely. So one of the things that, just to very briefly explain this whole thing about complexity. So in layman verbiage, so to speak, complexity tends to be interpreted as, in lack of better terms, a higher state of complicatedness, right? Mm-hmm. If something is really difficult to grasp, we say, oh, that's very complex. But that's not what complexity is at all. Complexity is something altogether different. So in nature, you have three kinds of systems. You have ordered systems. Basically, if we do A, it will lead to B. Ordered systems can be either obvious, again, A will lead to B, it will lead to B every single time, or they can be complicated. So doing A will lead to B, C, or D, but it will lead to B, C, or D every single time. In an ordered system, there's no new information if you zoom out, right? So the whole is equal to the sum of all the parts. Then you have chaotic systems. Up is down. There are no linear causalities or causalities to speak of. It's literally chaos, right? That luckily doesn't happen to a lot of organizations. But then we get to this thing called complexity and complex adaptive systems. Now, in complex adaptive systems, doing A will lead to all kinds of things. And we can never know beforehand what's going to happen. If we zoom out in a complex system, we are going to find new kinds of behavior, new information, right? A very simple explanation of this or example of this would be an ant. So the behavior of an ant is quite predictable. But if we extrapolate that behavior onto that of a colony, it doesn't work like that because the colony in and of itself has its own behavior, right? But conversely, you cannot take the behavior of a colony and then reduce it down into the behavior of a single ant. Now, human beings are, of course, a lot more complex than ants. So human systems are a lot more complex than colonies. What this means is that the traditional sort of view of how markets work and the way that we do strategy is basically one of order. We think that if we just do this one thing A, then it will lead to B, or maybe it'll lead to C or D, but it will lead to one of those things. Anyone who's worked in practice knows that that's not how things go, right? You have your plan, you try to execute it, and then all kinds of stuff happens. COVID, for example. So when you work with complexity, you need to work with it in a slightly different way. And that's when you get the emergent stuff. You need to run parallel experiments. You need to be open to learning things. And again, any organization will need a mix of both the deliberate stuff, the traditional stuff, and the emergent stuff, the sort of complex stuff. And if we can do that, we're better off.
To go back to trying to actually identify what to go after, what not to go after, how would you approach that?
So what are we discussing here? Is it a new startup? Is this a small company, large company?
Say an early stage business that wants to take itself to the next level. It's understood the market. Are there questions you would help them to ask? How would you go about helping them?
Well, in a complex system, and this is both a sort of a blessing and a curse, I suppose, if you're a strategist, you have to start by defining where you are. Typically, traditionally, this would be called a diagnostics phase, right?
Sure.
And we've all done this. But the problem is that certain techniques that we have been using historically, for example, root cause analysis, such as the 5 whys, that does not work because you cannot reduce a complex system. Remember what I said about the colony and the ant. So we need to use different techniques. But the first thing you need to establish is where are we now? And then I would speak to the founder, the owner, the board, whatever it might be, and try to get a sense of, okay, so what's the overall concept of the business? What is the overall sort of direction that we want to go in? If you're a small company, some small companies, new companies, they want to grow. They want to grow fast. Other companies want to be profitable. Some companies are just looking to essentially build a solid foundation upon which they can later build whatever it is that needs to be built. So again, the first thing you need to do is you need to define the context in which you're going to act, the company's specific context. And then off of that, you try to figure out, okay, does that mean we need to work with a new kind of IP strategy? Does this mean we need to do some product innovation? Is the marketing something we need to work on? And so on and so forth. But the point is that if you're working with markets and markets are complex, everything is context specific. There are no context universal or context free rules. In other words, going into a small company, you just have to define, okay, so what is this company about? Where does it want to go? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this organization? And how can I take that as a strategist and build towards whatever it is that they're striving towards? The essence of strategy really is not one of sacrifice. It's the move from equiprobability. In other words, it's to improve the odds of a certain outcome, never to guarantee it. That'll be placebo strategy, but to improve the odds of a certain outcome. And that's your job as a strategist. You just need to figure out, okay, so are we going this way or are we going that way, and why? So that will be where you would start.
Okay, so when you're considering changing markets and what business you're really in, you're essentially thinking business strategy, aren't you? It's not a brand strategy issue. I'm trying to separate the two completely.
Yes, that would be a business strategic or possibly marketing strategic question. Right. Brand strategy for me is not to do with what market to go after. Although I can see that some people will probably see that as such. Given that within brand strategy, you couldn't find, for example, your brand hierarchies and things like that in your portfolios, and you might cater certain products to certain markets or certain kinds of customers and so on. In my view, or my world, that's more to do with business strategy, personally. But again, I used to be very snobby about what people called things. These days, I'm not, as long as everyone agrees within the organization what we mean.
Sure.
Then I think it's fair game.
What about positioning? When you're thinking positioning, do you think that's mainly a brand issue or a business?
So positioning in my world, so to speak, is it's either one or two things. Now, you can either have competitive positioning, then we are firmly in the realm of someone like Michael Porter, in which basically we try to figure out what products we're going to use or sell to what customers and what markets. Then we are going to see if we can't differentiate within that. Now, typically, that's not how markets work, unfortunately. The problem is that a lot of that stuff is based on how markets looked 150 years ago. Because if you go back and you sort of look you look at who Porter built his work upon, or whose work he built his work upon, you realize that you can sort of track it way back almost to the Industrial Revolution. And although it will be very nice to be able to sort of delineate your competitors on a piece of paper, the problem is that the rest of the world won't really care about that. So even if you're working, the most classic example of positioning and segmentation and those things would be well, I'm going to be this kind of company and I'm only going to sell my kind of product in my city, for example, just locally. Well, the problem is that with the globalization, you're still competing against companies from the other side of the world. Because, of course, they can sell online and whatever else. So again, positioning, competitive positioning, if you want to do that, sure, do that, but take it with a grain of salt. Now, then we get into the other bit of positioning, which is what I call perceptive positioning, which is the traditional marketing positioning. The problem with that is that it presupposes that your customers will think of certain things when they think of you. We know that's not true based off of the work of Byron Sharp and others. Rather, they tend to have category generic views in their heads. Having said that, I do realize that positioning can actually be quite valuable from a sort of efficiency standpoint. And this maybe it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but my point is that if we define these are the things we're going to stand for, because typically that's perceptive positioning. We want to be this kind of brand, right? It can actually cut meeting times because people don't have to have meetings in which we're going to discuss, okay, so do we need to be happy for this campaign, or are we sad, or are we this, or are we that? It can also be a lot easier to brief agencies, for example, if you just go, well, our positioning is this, and the CP that we want to cover is that, or whatever else. And then lastly, I think the positioning can have a point if you have juniors working for you. So if you bring someone in who's fresh out of university or whatever it might be, it's a lot easier for them typically, and I am talking about marketers here, to just go, okay, so I need to create a campaign with these three things in mind, this perceptive positioning in mind. That's a lot easier than just telling them, okay, so here's how brands grow 1 and 2, and here are a couple other things. And oh yeah, by the way, this is the complexity stuff, and come back to me in 5 years' time. Competitive positioning, again, it can be something that sort of take with a grain of salt as a sort of a document just to create the essence of the company. That's fine. Perceptive positioning as a tool, that's fine, but consider the tactical tool more so than a strategic one.
Well, Seth Godin distinguishes between differentiation and positioning because he says positioning is a service you do to the customer. It enables them to kind of label you and know what box to put you in. Whereas differentiation is trying to say that you're different to everyone else. And, that's a sort of different exercise. I wonder what you think of separating the two, positioning and differentiation.
I think there are two different things. So I am with him on that. I think, unfortunately, Seth Godin has gone off the rails a bit recently, but I think that's a fair point. Differentiation, yes. His blog of the last couple of years is, I can't really take him seriously. But anyway, but my point is that I think that's fine and fair enough. The problem is that companies aren't differentiated. We know that, right? The other thing is that this idea of people putting you into specific boxes, again, that's not what people do. Rather, they tend to put you in the same box as everyone else within the category. So although he is, at least half correct in theory, it's not necessarily how companies work in practice, at least based on recent research.
Okay. So when you're presumably the business is running and set up, and then they need a brand strategy. What would they need to think about that's kind of unique to brand?
Well, the first thing you need to try to figure out is what do we mean by brand within the organization? Because brand can mean all kinds of things. It can be the product, it can be the visual identity, it can be, everything and then some. Start with that. And then if we are looking for a brand strategy for an existing company, what we're usually talking about is defining distinctive brand assets, whether that's your logos, your jingles, website, like colors, whatever it might be. And those things are going to be consistent over time. So we just need to sort of break that down and have it on paper and build towards that with some sort of continuity. Apart from that, everything is going to be context specific. It depends on, okay, so what's the task that we're trying to do here, or rather, what's it, the job we're trying to to do, what problem are we trying to solve with this brand strategy, and so on. And also, of course, what already exists. Are we going in with a carte blanche, and do a complete rebrand of the organization? Are we looking to build upon what is sort of already been built, and so on and so forth? So again, you're looking at context-specific things.
Well, often designers seem to say they need to do brand strategy whenever somebody wants branding or rebranding. So I just wonder what exactly that means, how it's going to differ from whatever strategy the business has. Really, I mean, sometimes they talk about brand personality, which I'm not sure that actually means anything. So if they're not going to be looking at that, it seems a lot of the questions I've read in books that designers might take into account are very, very broad ones, which go to the heart of who are we, what are we all about, as a starting point before deciding on a visual identity. So that's really what I'm getting at. What sort of questions would you ask to help the organization decide what its brand strategy is going to be, even? And also, most people don't really understand what brand is. They think it's a logo or something. So there's an educational element involved.
Yes. Again, the first question you need to ask is, what do we mean by brand? And then you define that. The problem I have with designers who go in, and usually they have their quote unquote big idea, and then they're trying to reshape the entire organization and the image of their big idea. It's just, it doesn't really work that well in practice. And of course, as well, if we are talking about distinctiveness in the sense of just building through continuity and being easily recognized, then we can't change our visual identity, every half year, 2 years, whatever it might be. Those things take time to build. But of course, if you are a sort of visual artist or designer, then you're going to see the same logo every day out and day in. You're going to get bored with it, and then you need to change it. The problem, of course, is that your customers are maybe going to see it 1 second, for every 2-3 months or whatever it might be. So there needs to be consistency there.
A really good point. People get very bored with their own branding and want to change, I think, quite often when they want to rebrand.
Yes, absolutely true. Absolutely true from my experience.
Do you help people to brief designers for their brand, or how, what sort of work do you do?
I occasionally help clients brief agencies, but it's more to do with campaign work and advertising campaigns rather than graphical stuff. I tend to work mainly with large global companies, and they have most of that stuff in-house anyway. And a complete rebranding for a global organization is a huge project, and then some. Yeah. And if I'm being completely blunt and honest, those kinds of gigs tend to go to creative agencies anyway. For small companies, it's the same thing. I think that if you want to define your visual identity, if you want to work with a designer, again, it's a matter of, you need to find the things that you're comfortable with and like, because it's going to be there for a long time. If you're McDonald's, for example, if you're in a city, and this is something that Rory Sutherland likes to point out, if you're in a city and you have no idea what the best local restaurants are, the food variance from great to essentially food poisoning is quite dramatic, and you see the golden arches, at least what is, if I go to McDonald's, I won't get the best meal in the world, but probably I won't get food poisoning. And Rory's point is that McDonald's is largely successful because they're very good at not being very bad. Now, I would argue that that's true, but it's also true for essentially all their competitors. His point basically is that brands act as heuristics. And the thing is, of course, that if McDonald's were to change the golden arches all the time because some designer found them boring, then you would not recognize McDonald's in that new city that you're in. So recognizability, if you want to put it in those terms, is really important for brands. You need to be easily recognized. And if we change stuff all the time, then we're not going to be that. And I fully appreciate, because I've had conversations with designers working for clients that they get bored. But the problem is that their consumers, they don't get bored because they don't think about the brand all the time. We do.
Well, Byron Sharp really drives home the importance of distinctiveness. How much has your approach changed towards brand strategy since he published his work?
Byron has been quite important to me in general, but also his, I hate to use the term right-hand man because he's a man in his own right and then some, but John Doss, who also works for the EBI, has been very helpful. In every gig I've done since, in every project that I've run or every client I work with, the patterns that he discusses, I've seen them. The thing about all the other stuff, it's very hit and miss. Sometimes you find the things that the positioning people or traditional people talk about, and sometimes you don't. Usually you don't. Whereas the EBI stuff, EBI being the Arabic Bath Institute for which Byron works, it's just based on evidence. It's not based on opinion. It's just based on evidence, and you see it all the time. Whether you're running brand trackers for clients or whatever it might be. So it is one of those things where it has changed my view a lot, but also for the better. As a side note, and this is not something that Byron necessarily talks about. I'm not even sure he's aware of this, but the EBI stuff works a lot better with market complexity than the traditional stuff does, because it basically looks at emergent patterns such as negative binomial distribution, which can be summarized in every company will have a few customers who are going to buy them a lot and a lot of customers who are going to buy them a little. And that's another one of those patterns that you see with every company that you work with. It's absolutely insane how consistent it is. So if you're a marketer, you haven't read How Brands Grow, first of all, don't think of it as opinion. It's based on evidence. You can, scrutinize that evidence. I know that you as well have a background in legal work. But you look at what's the value of the evidence, and then you can make your own conclusions off of that. So you need to read How Brands Grow, and then you take that and you apply it into your own business, and then you see, okay, does it hold up for us or not? Now, from my experience, again, it holds up every single time, but maybe it doesn't for you. Who knows? The point is, you look at the evidence, does it fit what I do, and then you work accordingly. What you don't want to do is read someone who says, well, Google did this, therefore you, small brand who sells gravel, should do the same. Because you're looking at completely different contexts. It's like comparing apples to oranges.
Well, I see a lot of problems actually in the whole branding market, especially around naming, where people think they need to describe, a product as closely as possible to get to saying what it does without necessarily describing it.
Yes.
Instead of just giving it a name. And, if you're trying to be distinctive, you have to stand out. And the name is so important. But I gather marketers are not trained in naming, which is probably why there are all these problems.
Yes. I mean, I think that's part of it. I think a lot of naming tends to go with trends and if we're honest, halo effects. So, for example, when Google really hit its stride and became famous, and all of a sudden you'd see, every company would be something double vowel something else. So there is a lot of imitation going on. But it is, to your point, naming is one of those things that people either don't take seriously or take too seriously, if you know what I mean. It's either we're going to call it, something generic and we don't care, or it's, well, actually, this first letter represents this ancient Greek god that blah, 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 and no consumer ever is going to make that distinction. So it's one of those things. Again, you need to find some sort of middle ground and a catchy name. A catchy name can become a distinctive brand asset as well. Which is,
I was here listening to Byron Sharp actually pointing out that McDonald's is a Scottish name of an American burger joint. It doesn't really matter what the name is once you've got a name, as long as it's not really going to hold you back. A name is a name, and it identifies the business. That's the primary objective of it.
Yes, absolutely true. So, I mean, in McDonald's case, what they probably shouldn't have done, or though, who knows what would have happened, but if they would have just called it Hamburger Incorporated, who knows whether it had worked or not in terms
Yeah,
of just the power of the name.
yeah. I'm
And
sure it
then,
wouldn't have if
yeah,
they had a
but
descriptive name like
yeah,
Google, if it was called search engine.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then, but similarly, if they had called it, something with 7 X's and 5 Y's and 3 Q's, then people wouldn't have recognized it anyway, because they wouldn't have been able to spell it. And that's also one of those things that I'm sure I would love to hear your view on this, but it's something that I would imagine that one takes into account these days is, looking at your naming from a sort of search engine optimization standpoint. Is it easy enough to spell? Can people actually write it down? If it's too difficult to spell, then people won't necessarily be able to find it online, and so on and so forth. I mean, what's your experience in that?
Yeah, it's absolutely key. I'm not very much in favor of using numbers instead of, say, four. People put a four. Anything like that, which is going to confuse people as to how to spell it, how to find you, isn't really going to serve the brand very much.
No, I mean, it's one of Byron's perpetual points, is that you need to be easy to remember and easy to buy, or easy to think of and easy to buy. And that very much plays into that, I would say.
Yeah, easy to spell. And if your own personal name is very difficult, then I would say don't use your personal name for the business. So,
no, that's very true. I mean, on a personal note, it's why I go by JP internationally, because my first name is Yuan, which is quite difficult to pronounce for people who don't speak Swedish. So it's a lot easier for people to say JP. And because I do a lot of keynote speaking internationally, then it's they get the pronunciation correct. Same with my wife's name, although it's something that you learn quite quickly. Is there's one rule to a successful marriage, and that's happy wife, happy life. So even if her name was difficult to spell, I'd probably go with it anyway if it made her happy. But Castellan is quite easy to spell, and it's quite straightforward and quite easy to pronounce, and so that works in my favor, I suppose.
Yeah. So you're Swedish by background, are you?
Yes. Born and raised
And are
here.
you located there? Do you live there?
Yes. I've moved about a bit, but now, of course, with COVID, I can't really travel the way that I used to. Typically, I work with a couple of big Swedish brands too, global brands, but most of my work is internationally. So I do travel a fair bit. And then, as I said, I do a lot of keynote speaking. So I travel to conferences and speak about whatever's on my mind typically.
So you are essentially focused on helping big, complex organizations to sort out their brand hierarchies. And
Yeah, well, yes, I do a fair bit of quote unquote traditional global strategy as well, actually defining the strategy and building it. And that's also one of those things that one needs to keep in mind, is that every strategy within the strategy hierarchy tends to have a specific functionality. So the global strategy, for example, we know that all the regions that we try to control, or at least get, in some form of semblance of an order, they are going to be coming up across all kinds of problems that are unique to them, right? So there's going to be emergent stuff. But the point of global strategy is effectively regional steering. So that is one of those things where we're going to do a quote unquote traditional strategy. And then within that, we're going to allow certain things, but we're basically trying to create alignment. And we are aware that some things may not be theoretically optimal, but they are practically sort of necessary. So we're going to do that. But no, yeah, I do global strategy a lot. And then, as I said, a lot of strategic management, which is more in the business strategic realm of things, I suppose. And then, yeah, again, a lot of complexity management. And complexity management is perhaps, it's not something that small brands can, in any shape or form avoid, but typically they have more pressing matters than going into, how to create diversity of thought within management teams and those kinds of things, which I do a fair bit of work in.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, JP, for coming on the podcast. Just one final question. What's your book going to be about?
Unfortunately, I can't say.
Right.
I've because, and I'll explain why. So we've written in the past every year something called the Rouse Room Manifesto, and it was
Yes,
started
I
out,
looked it
yeah.
up. Mhm.
And so it started out with me and Gary, essentially putting our thoughts into writing, and then we published it, and it became very popular very quickly, which was quite fun for us. And now it's used primarily as, I think, as upskilling for agencies. I know it's on the curriculum in certain universities as well. But anyway, and this year it's going to be called the Castle Manifesto, and it is it's basically a polemic against traditional strategic doctrine. And I talk about all the problems with exactly this kind of things we've been discussing in this podcast, but I do not present the solution. And the book will contain the solution, which is why I can't really say what the solution is going to be just yet. You'll have to buy the book to find out. But it's looking very good. I am very excited about it, and I've been asked to write a book for years and years, and now it feels like the time is right. And so me and Gary are writing it, and it's looking to be very, very good. So fingers crossed.
Oh, I'll look out for it. Great. Well, thank you very much then.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the Brand Tuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtune.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you, and bye for now.